All right, so we're diving into a cold case today, one that really shook a community to its core.
Yeah, this one's a tough one, for sure.
Back in 2001, Nicholas P. Hester was murdered. And the circumstances surrounding his death, well, they're just shrouded in mystery.
You know, it's always so sad when someone's life is cut short.
Absolutely. And today, we're going to try to unpack what we know about this case and see if we can gain some insight into what might have happened to Nicholas.
You know what gets me about cases like these? There are just so many unanswered questions, and even years later, those questions can still haunt a community.
Yeah, you're right about that. So let's start with the basics. Tell me, who was Nicholas P. Hester? What kind of a life did he lead?
Well, sadly, there's not a ton of readily available information about Nicholas' personal life. I mean, this was 2001. Social media wasn't what it is today.
Right.
But from what we've been able to gather, Nicholas was a young man living in a small town. He was well known in the community.
Okay, so a familiar face, someone people recognized.
Exactly, and that makes this whole thing even more perplexing. Someone like that doesn't just disappear without someone noticing.
So the day Nicholas died, what do we know about his movements or his plans? Was there anything unusual about that day?
Well, there isn't a detailed timeline available, but we do know it seemed like an ordinary day for Nicholas, at least initially.
So nothing out of the ordinary that raised any immediate red flags?
No, not that we know of. And you know that's often the case, right? Life's going on, it seems normal, and then bam, everything changes in an instant.
That's eerie. So let's talk about the discovery of his body. Where was he found, and what were the initial signs that pointed towards something criminal?
Again, the sources are pretty vague about the exact location, but the fact that it was ruled a homicide suggests the scene itself must have told a pretty clear story.
Okay, so something at the scene immediately indicated foul play. Like what, for instance? Signs of a struggle.
Could be, yeah. Or perhaps the location itself was unusual. Maybe it was somewhere Nicholas wouldn't typically be found, making it obvious that something was very wrong.
And what about the autopsy? What did that tell investigators about how Nicholas died?
Unfortunately, the specific cause of death hasn't been publicly released. However, the sources do emphasize the brutal nature of the attack.
Oh, that's just awful.
It was, yeah. And it definitely suggested that this was not a random act of violence.
So with no clear suspects right away, where did investigators turn? What were some of the initial leads they pursued?
Well, you know, standard procedure in these cases is to start with the victim's inner circle. So I'm sure they interviewed family, friends, anyone who might have had recent contact with Nicholas.
Looking for any sort of conflict, any motive, however small.
Exactly. They'd be trying to piece together a picture of Nicholas's life, his relationships, anything that might point them in the direction of a suspect.
Did anything come out of those early interviews? Any persons of interest or potential leads?
Unfortunately, it seems like those initial leads didn't pan out, at least not right away.
All right, so let's move on to the forensic evidence. What kind of evidence was collected at the scene, and how did technology back in 2001 impact the investigation?
Well, you've got your usual suspects, fingerprints, maybe some trace evidence like hair fibers, things like that.
And DNA evidence.
Well, DNA testing was around in 2001, but it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it is today. It was a much slower process, and the databases they had weren't as comprehensive.
So even if they had DNA, it might not have led them to a match right away.
Exactly. So they had to rely more heavily on other forms of evidence and good old-fashioned detective work.
And how did this case impact the community? It must have been pretty devastating.
Oh, absolutely. In a small town, a crime like this just rocks everyone to their core. You know, it's the sense of safety and security. It's just shattered.
And Nicholas's family and friends, they must have been going through just unimaginable grief.
It's hard to even fathom what they must have gone through. Not only the loss of Nicholas, but also the mysteries surrounding his death.
So with all these challenges facing them, how did investigators finally catch a break in the case?
You know, that's the million-dollar question. The sources don't go into detail about what specifically led to the suspect's arrest.
So we're left to speculate.
It could have been anything, really. Maybe a witness finally came forward with a key piece of information, something they hadn't realized was important at the time. Or maybe advancements in forensic technology allowed them to re-examine evidence and uncover something new.
But eventually, they did identify a suspect and bring them to trial. And it must have been quite a trial, with everyone in the community watching closely.
Trials are always intense. You've got two sides battling it out, trying to convince the jury of their version of events.
So what were some of the key arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense?
Well, without more specifics, it's hard to say for sure. But I'd imagine the prosecution would have relied heavily on the forensic evidence they'd gathered.
And any witness testimony they might have had.
Yeah, that's crucial, especially in a small town where people often know each other. A credible witness can really sway a jury.
And the defense. What would their strategy have been?
They would have been looking to create reasonable doubt, of course, pointing out any inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, questioning the reliability of witnesses, things like that.
It's a shame we don't have more details about the trial itself.
It would be fascinating to see how it all played out, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. So the trial concludes, and a verdict is reached.
And in this case, that verdict was guilty.
Which brings us to our final question. How is Nicholas being remembered today? What is his legacy?
Well, unfortunately, the sources don't provide much information about how Nicholas is being remembered by his loved ones or the community.
But even though we may not have all the answers, his story serves as a reminder that every life is precious and every loss is felt deeply, especially in a tight-knit community.
And it's also a reminder that even in cold cases, justice can sometimes prevail, even if it takes years, even decades.
It's a powerful message of hope and perseverance.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. I know we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but I think it's important to keep these stories alive.
Right. These cases, they remind us that there are real people behind the headlines. People whose lives were cut short, families who are left to grieve.
And they challenge us to never stop seeking the truth.
Absolutely.
To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this difficult but important journey. And if you have any information about the murder of Nicholas P. Hester, no matter how small, please reach out to the appropriate authorities. Every piece of information could be crucial in bringing closure to this case.
That's so important.
So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
Stay safe.